Hello there, my name is Robert Tercek. I'm the author of a book called Vaporized. And today I'm going to tell you more about the principles and concepts inside of that book. The thoughts that are contained in that book are particularly relevant right now. I'm speaking to you in the early phase of the pandemic, the global COVID-19 pandemic that has caused tremendous amounts of change in the economy and in sociology and human behavior around the world right now. Now, some pundits, folks, have said that the pandemic is going to finish the job that the internet started. It's an interesting notion. It's debatable. Well, that remains to be seen. But here's what I can tell you. Certainly, it is true that the pandemic and the response to it has greatly accelerated certain trends in digital technology, in digital media, and the whole digital economy. And today, I want to talk to you about those trends through the lens of my concept, Vaporized. For me, it started with an epiphany that happened in Hong Kong. In the 1980s, I had been working in New York City in the TV business. And in television, of course, we were getting typeset for graphics, and we were also working in post-production for audio. And I noticed that those two businesses were being transformed by personal computers. And very rapidly, the old techniques of doing typesetting mechanically or editing audio on tape were being replaced by digital techniques. But that had not yet begun to change television. Television still was very much an analog business in the 1980s. That all changed when I went to Hong Kong. MTV, Music Television, sent me to Hong Kong to launch MTV in Asia. And when I arrived, I had the assumption that we were working with state-of-the-art equipment in New York. And I expected to see similar equipment in Hong Kong. But I was quite wrong. The Hong Kong facility was completely digital. And we were able to do nonlinear editing and techniques that previously were unknown to most producers in the United States. So that was like a leapfrog into the future. At that time, I saw the possibilities for digital television. I began to imagine all the opportunities that lie ahead if you could digitize the TV industry. And when I arrived back in New York, I had gotten the digital fever. I decided to switch into the games industry where multimedia computers had just arrived in 1993. And I launched some of the very first computer games that had animation and graphics. And shortly after that, I began to work for other companies in the entertainment industry as they went through a digital transition. Those include companies like Packet Video, the very first company in the world to put video on mobile phones. I worked at Sony Pictures, where I was the head of digital media. I designed and launched dozens of online games that were quite successful in the 1990s for Sony, putting them at the very forefront of the network game business. And eventually I ended up working for Oprah Winfrey. And for Oprah, I was the head of digital media, the president of digital at OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network. And there I supervised some of the largest online learning programs ever launched in the world. So the things I learned from those processes are that, first of all, the digital media business was being gradually absorbed into the larger digital technology industry. And so it looked to me like television and media were gradually going to become a subset of a larger information business. And that was going to change the economics of the TV business entirely, as well as all the other media businesses that are related to that. But I also saw that there were new possibilities. It was going to actually change the kinds of stories that we tell and the kinds of experiences that we make. And so for me, this process, this experience of going to Hong Kong and studying the very first digital post-production facility that was available, it caused me to really rethink my entire outlook on a traditional industry and look at it in a different way. And I really never looked back at it the same way ever again. By the late 1990s, it became pretty clear that mobile phones were going to outpace computers, even though in the 90s, a mobile phone in the US was barely capable of holding a signal for a voice call for more than a few miles. Our mobile infrastructure wasn't very well developed, but in other parts of the world, and particularly in Asia and Northern Europe, mobile technology was developing really fast. And it was clear to me that the number of mobile devices that were being sold was greatly outpacing the number of computers. In any given year, maybe 100 million computers would be sold, which is an enormous number. But even in the 1990s, in the late 90s, we would see that 400 million mobile phones would be sold, and the number was growing every single year. And of course, today, now in the 2020s, we're seeing billions of mobile phones being sold. So the numbers there, the sheer pull, the demand pull, pulls innovation and accelerates digital trends. And as I spent time working in the mobile industry, I saw that it was going to change the way we operate as a society. Not just the way the media business works, not just the way we exchange information, but actually the way we operate, the way we function, the way we connect with each other and talk to each other. And I began to develop a theory for this, and I call it Vaporized. And today I want to tell you a little bit about the Vaporized theory, what's contained in my book and what's been the core of my practice since I wrote the book in 2015. First, let me explain the vaporized metaphor. It's quite simple. To me, information is a little bit like water in the sense that it can exist in different states. Now, for a long time, for thousands of years, if you wanted to encode information in a way that could be preserved and passed down from one generation to the next, you didn't have that many options. For most of human existence, the only way to preserve information was to carve it into stone or build it into a building or some sort of statue, and that was a way to preserve that information over time. But that's not a really rich communication. That's going to contain very little information. Then, of course, with the introduction of the book, we had a portable way to save information and pass it along to future generations. And the book has been the dominant metaphor for information for many, many years. But if you think about a book, they're heavy, they're bound. It's hard to share them simultaneously. They can be shared sequentially, but it's hard to share a book simultaneously unless you print a whole bunch of copies of it. And of course, that's where the printing press came into play. It made it possible to mechanically reproduce information for the very first time and share it. And of course, from that point on, we start to achieve the modern era. So from that point in the 1450s, when the printing press was invented, we start to see the history itself changes and society itself changes. But there are limitations with the book. Though a book is a great way to preserve information, it's slow. You can't change it. Once it's printed, it's done. It's locked. It's fixed. And so to me, this is information presented in a solid form. Just like the metaphor with water. When water is in a solid, it's ice. It's bound up. It's hard. It's brittle. It's not something that will move or not move very easily. It's quite heavy. It's quite dense. The molecules are packed together very closely. They don't move. But if you let that ice melt, then water takes on the form of a liquid. And now it can flow in a certain direction. And the same thing is true for information. As soon as we are able to translate information into an electronic form and connect it to electronic networks and digital networks, information began to flow. We all experienced this in the transition from dial-up internet in the 1990s to broadband internet in the 2000s, when information appliances became a reality. They'd been a theory for a long time, but then that PC at your home, instead of having like a dial-up internet session, you were able to actually go to that machine anytime with broadband and call up information on demand. That was a huge leap forward for people. We started to have a different behavior around information. We started to use information regularly, the same way we would rely on it like electricity in the home or plumbing in the home. But even then there were limitations. Information in a liquid state has to be connected, and it has to be connected to some sort of device that's got a wire coming out the back of it. So while that's incredibly powerful and a big transition, it's not the full transition that interests me. The next step is to go wireless. And that presents the opportunity to interpret information as atmosphere, information that can be downloaded over the air. And again, the metaphor to water still holds up. We now have information in the state of vapor. So we talked about information in the physical form, like a book. That's a solid. We have information in liquid form, like plumbing. That's information delivered over a broadband pipe to your computer, perhaps. Then it's like an appliance. It's like plumbing in your home or electricity in your home. But the third state, and the most interesting state to me, is information that's delivered like atmosphere, vaporized information, if you will. And that's the third state of matter, and in fact, we now live in a world permeated by information. We have information on demand that can be delivered over the air, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, no matter what situation or what place you happen to be in. There's information available for you that's relevant at that particular moment, and it's available at the touch of an icon on your smartphone. Now, to make this happen, of course, a lot of innovation had to occur in the background. We needed mobile broadband networks and super powerful mobile phones that contain computers inside them, miniaturized computers. And so it took decades and decades of innovation and a real series of innovations piled up on top of each other, stacked up on top of each other, to make this change possible. But today we take it for granted. When I launched Packet Video in 1999, people thought we were crazy to try to put video on a mobile phone because in those days, your mobile phone barely could do a voice call. It seemed preposterous. Today, 20 years later, we take it for granted. We FaceTime with our friends and our families, and particularly at this time of pandemic, the idea of using video to connect wirelessly with people all over the world is what's helping us keep our businesses going. So these ideas have gone from idea or theory into reality in a span of about 20 years. And in the process, they've transformed the world. The process of replacing physical things with invisible software that can be downloaded over the air. That's the core premise of Vaporized. That's what I try to explore in the book, and that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. Of course, there are winners and losers in this process. It is a form of digital disruption, if you will, but it's a very specific form of digital disruption. What we're talking about is substitution. If there's a way for someone to develop a mobile app or some other digital service that can be delivered over the air to a mobile device that replaces a physical product, it's going to totally transform the economics of the business of making and delivering that physical product. I'll give you some examples from my own experience. Of course, we've all lived through this process whereby people have stopped relying on traditional media products and they started to adopt digital media products and substituted them. Of course, the book has been vaporized. Amazon now sells more digital books than hardbound and paperback books combined. That's been true for many years. Music has been thoroughly displaced. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, lots of people bought CDs, and some people would download MP3s. But those behaviors have been entirely replaced, and so have the hardware that plays those things. Because today, you simply stream music. You sign up for a streaming music service like Spotify, and you have access to everything. You don't have to own anything. You don't have to manage a collection of discs. So we've replaced all that physical stuff with a service that's available over the air, on demand. The same is true for games. For the longest period of time, for 20 or 30 years, if you wanted to play a video game, you had to buy a special dedicated console and connect it to a television set. Today, that's over. You can download a game over the air and play it on your phone, many times for free. And so this has actually transformed the economics of the game business and thereby the content of the game business as well. Maps. In the past, when I would travel to a city, the first thing I would do would be to pick up a map at the front desk of the hotel so I could explore that city. Today, that's unnecessary. Today, an entire generation that was raised on smartphones is growing up with the expectation that they'll never be lost. They can go to any city in the world and just rely on their smartphone to find their way back. And they'll be presented with a map that's so much better than a paper map. It's presented in the language of their choice. It shows them exactly where they are. It shows them turn-by-turn directions to get to wherever they wish to go. It shows them things they wouldn't even notice or be aware of. Highlights information, local landmarks that they might otherwise miss that might just be a block or two away. And so the physical map has been replaced by this software map that can be downloaded and updated over the air. And if you don't like the map that comes built into your mobile phone, well then by all means you can replace it with any number of other maps that compete. And of course this spurs the introduction of all kinds of services. And I'll get into that in a little bit about how a map or another product can become a platform for innovation. It's not just maps and music and media that have been vaporized. In fact, the vaporization process extends to all the devices that used to play that stuff, that used to allow us to play things like a DVD or a game. If you were to think about 2006, the last year before the modern smartphones were introduced, if you think about that time, you might recall in an airplane, if you walked down the aisle of an airplane, you would notice that people had all sorts of different gizmos, MP3 players, portable game machines, DVD players. Today, all that stuff is landfill. Today, all that stuff is obsolete. We simply don't have a need for it because today when you walk down the aisle of an airplane, you'll notice that everybody's using a tablet or a smartphone and they have access to all of those things without the cumbersome task of carrying around the chargers and the equipment of all those players. And by the way, this vaporization process has hit the consumer electronics companies very hard. So the companies that made cameras and DVD players and GPS units and MP3 players, those companies have experienced double-digit decreases in sales of consumer electronics at the same time that the smartphone has seen increases of up to 500-fold sales. And so basically the smartphone has absorbed all the functionality of those other devices, and it's inflicted major damage on consumer electronics companies. This trend towards vaporization of industries isn't limited to media or consumer electronics. It extends into the travel industry, the advertising industry. Any number of industries are starting to be affected and transformed forever by it. One big one that you'll notice is retail. And retail is really significant in a couple of important ways I want to share with you. The first thing is that the process I'm describing so far, this process of substituting some sort of mobile app or information on your mobile phone for a physical product, it's mostly invisible. We rarely notice it. Things are disappearing, and that's hard for us to pay attention to or to notice or to keep hold of. So today, if you are living in California, for instance, where we have robot vehicles and little robots, delivery robots being tested on the road, you might notice some of the signs of disruption and some of the signs of innovation. But In other parts of the country, the only signs you see of digital disruption are signs that say going out of business in the windows of major retail chains. And every year, for the past 5 years, we've noticed that more and more national chains, retail chains, are closing their doors forever. And of course, the pandemic drove a major number of companies to go out of business entirely. That's because consumers couldn't shop, but there's a bigger trend behind that, which is the shift towards online and the shift towards delivery. And this is substitution, again, for retail and for physical real estate towards at-home shopping or mobile shopping and on-demand delivery. That's a gigantic shift that's occurring. And it's hitting shopping centers really hard. Now, hundreds of shopping centers in the United States have gone out of business and closed their doors forever. In an ironic twist of fate, the largest shopping center in the world was the Randall Park Mall. And that Randall Park Mall has now been razed to the ground and replaced by a logistics and e-commerce fulfillment center by Amazon. And so it's a kind of paradox that these old shopping malls are now being replaced by e-commerce fulfillment centers, logistics centers, and data centers for the new vaporized economy. So as you can see from the comments I've made so far, this process of vaporization touches a number of trends that many folks have heard about and talked about, things like digitization, where we start to digitize a traditional business, replace it with software. The idea of dematerialization, where we're replacing physical stuff with invisible software, with information. The concept of decentralization, where you no longer have to go to a particular physical place to get something, but it can be distributed over the air, no matter where you are. Placeless innovation, if you will. Democratization, because these tools are generally open to most people, and many of the platforms are also open to developers to innovate on top of. And so this vaporized process takes advantage of many of those trends and incorporates them. But at the same time, it's also driving consolidation on a massive scale. Let me talk about the big winners in the smartphone era to illustrate exactly what I mean about consolidation in vaporization. For me, the vaporized era really goes into overdrive and really hits its stride with the introduction of the modern smartphone. And the smartphone era, I think, begins in 2007. Now, some of the folks listening to this will say, hang on a second, there were plenty of companies making smartphones in the earlier 2000s. And that's true. And those are companies like Nokia and Research in Motion and Palm. But none of those companies today exist in their previous state. Those are companies that did not make this transformation in a successful way. They're evolutionary roadkill on the way to the vaporized era. The companies that really succeeded in a big way were the big internet platforms that we all know about today. Companies like Apple, Alphabet, formerly Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and a number of Chinese companies as well that have emerged recently as leaders on the global stage. These are companies that understood the dynamics of what was happening with vaporization. They understood how to substitute software for physical products, and they embraced it, and they made that the core of their business, and they began to absorb the revenues and the business opportunities from the companies that they were disrupting, the industries that they were causing so much turmoil in. So if you'll agree with me, for the sake of argument, that the modern smartphone era begins when Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, then let's consider what the world looked like back in 2006. In 2006, if you made a list of the most valuable companies in the world, that list would be dominated by energy companies, and in particular ExxonMobil at the very top. And ExxonMobil is a perfect example of this because they are kind of the epitome, if you will, the exemplar of the industrial economy of the 20th century. And the remnants of John Rockefeller's energy companies back from 100 years earlier. That was in 2006. And at that time, there's really only one technology company that would have been ranked among the top 10 most valuable companies in the world, and that was Microsoft. But after 2006, Apple introduced the iPhone, and a couple years later, we had Android, we had app stores, and then those mobile phones, those smartphones, became open platforms for innovation. And thereby, huge numbers of people began to adopt the smartphone. And we saw a societal shift as people shifted towards smartphones, away from traditional feature phones. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of smartphones later, just 10 years later, by 2016, you had a completely transformed economic landscape. And the leaders in this landscape were all technology giants, led by Apple, at twice the market capitalization of ExxonMobil 10 years earlier, followed by Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. Facebook. Now, ExxonMobil was still on the list in 2016, but greatly diminished and not near the top of that list. They're fading fast. Now, at the time, people thought there was a bubble back in 2016, but that's not the case. Those companies continued to grow from 2016 through 2018. Each of the companies I mentioned, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, added on average $200 billion to their market capitalization in a 2-year span between 2016 and 2018. And that trend continues today. Since 2016, Apple has doubled and doubled in value, and they're not the only ones. And the pandemic has driven these companies to ever greater heights. As I speak to you now, in 2020, Apple is now hovering in valuation around $2 trillion. Amazon and Microsoft and Google are hovering around $1.5 trillion in valuation. These are records, outsized records in terms of valuations of companies. So it's certainly clear that this vaporization trend has been accelerated by the pandemic as people were forced to stay at home, unable to travel, unable to commute to work. They were reliant more and more on communication devices and digital substitution for physical things. So these companies have driven consolidation, and they've ridden to great valuation in the process. Increasingly, governments around the world have begun to express concern about the amount of control that these consolidated internet platforms exert over the economy and over society. They're not wrong to be concerned, but the prescribed remedies won't necessarily solve the problems. And we see one country after another trying to draft legislation to govern the behavior of these companies, but it might be that they're unable to actually define the nature of the problem correctly. In the United States at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about rewriting monopoly law to control the giant internet platforms and possibly force them to break up. It's unclear, though, that these companies actually are monopolies because they compete fiercely with each other. And of course, it's a very innovative field, and so there's always the possibility that a new entrant will come in and disrupt the disruptors. One thing I think is missed quite frequently is the nature of these platforms is very different from monopolies of the past. And so it's important to understand that where a traditional monopoly could dominate the economics of a left-to-right value chain, a kind of classic Michael Porter style value chain where raw materials are transformed into ingredients or components, and then they're turned into a product that's produced and manufactured and then distributed and then sold at retail to consumers. So one or two players in that value chain could dominate that value chain and extract extra margin from the other players. And that's your kind of classic monopolistic play. We've seen that from everything from oil in the Rockefeller days to Microsoft in the modern era. That's not necessarily what happens with the vaporized companies. These companies that have dominated this process of vaporization, they build gigantic platforms, globe-spanning platforms. These platforms ride on the back of the telecommunication network, and they rose to global dominance with the rise of 4G. Of course, these platforms began farther earlier before the 4G was introduced. They began even before 3G was introduced, but they rode to global dominance with the advance of fast, high-speed internet available to mobile phones. That's really what made it possible for the big modern internet platforms to extend their reach on a global basis to people all over the world. Now, if you think about what's at the core of a telephone network, like imagine back to the early days of AT&T and their dominance in the United States, what made it possible for AT&T to be dominant was that they controlled the switchboard. It's not so important to control the wires. It's not that important to control the phones. AT&T tried to control all of that back in their heyday. But the function of the switchboard, connecting one call to another, or basically connecting people to whatever it is they seek, that was the key point for value control. And AT&T dominated that. And that is true today. Anything running on a telecom network, the switchboard that connects people together, connects people with whatever it is they search for or seek, that switchboard is a key value control point. Now, in a digital environment, you can add monetization to that. So you can make it possible to connect people with what they seek and make some money in the process, either through advertising or by selling something, or doing that as a service for people that they'll pay for. So the first layer of the platform is the switchboard, the digital switchboard that connects people with what they want. The next layer is the ability to monetize. And the next layer on top of that is tools. Tools that enable third parties, typically developers and publishers, to create new experiences on top of that platform that they can monetize. As long as there's a way to get paid, you'll find that innovation can happen. And if the tools are open and freely available to developers, then you'll see a lot of innovation occur. And this is innovation that happens outside of these big platforms. They don't control it. They don't manage it. They just provide an incentive in the form of a way to get paid. That's where the monetization tools are. And then they provide creative tools that allow people to build things freely, without direction, without a mandate, free innovation on top of these platforms. And eventually, if you have enough developers working, a new kind of crop of companies will emerge that sell things to each other. And we call this a multi-sided platform, and sometimes we use this interchangeably with the word ecosystem. And ecosystem is a good word because it is a nice metaphor for what's happening on top of these platforms, because there's kind of a natural growth. And as long as there's some revenue opportunity for each of the companies so that they can thrive and prosper, they'll find ways to cross-sell to each other, market to each other, provide services to each other, and so forth. And so a mini economy starts to grow on top of the platform. And of course, all the richness of that mini economy creates even more opportunities for consumer audiences to get benefit from their phone. And of course, it drives even more innovation in terms of what's being vaporized or things that are being turned into digital software on top of these platforms. So that process, beginning with the switchboard that connects people, and then the monetization tools that allow developers to make money from the transactions of connecting people to what they want, and then the tools that allow developers to innovate and create new services, things that even the owners of the platform didn't conceive of. And then finally, the ecosystem, where new tools and services come to help those developers enrich in their services, connect with more customers, help customers find new things. This richly layered and complex ecosystem is not really contemplated in the current legislation or the current recommendations in various governments to break up monopolies. And the most important point that's missing is that there's a further layer of control, and that's control of the information, the data that is generated on these platforms. And that is the proprietary asset of the platform owners. And that gives them a kind of extra intelligence about what's happening. They can see trends before anyone else. They can see what consumers are looking for before anyone else. So that's a tremendously powerful advantage that the owners of the platforms have. In a way, it allows them to predict the future. Not just predict the future, but they can shape the future because they can anticipate the trends, they can anticipate what consumers are going for next, and they can develop products and recommend those products. And that is the crux of the issue for these gigantic, highly consolidated, globe-spanning digital platforms. Let's consider the way the large platforms control their developers, how they exert control. This question of control is at the heart of the issue of monopolies and consolidation. There are four ways that the big platforms can control a developer. The first one is that they offer tools for creation. And for professional developers, for companies that make software, those tools typically consist of a software development kit and APIs, application programming interfaces. And these give access to some of the core functions of the platform without revealing how those necessarily work. It makes it possible for a developer to utilize the core platform without actually showing that developer how it functions or revealing some of the trade secrets. And that means that the features that are developed by the developers, they don't have to replicate core features of the platform. They can take advantage of what the features are inside of that platform without having to know necessarily how they work or having to reveal how they work. For consumers, the big platforms offer easy tools to use, easy tools for communication, things like messaging and chat, but also ways for people to do video communications with each other, easy ways to create and edit video and store it, ways to create GIFs and graphics and so forth. And so tools for self-expression, and more broadly, tools for managing your own information. In some cases, tools that allow you to upload that information into the cloud and store it with those big platforms. This is another means of content creation. In both cases, whether it's a professional development firm that's building an app or a consumer that's simply taking photos on their phone and storing them in the cloud, in both cases, what's happening is that these platforms are making the platforms very sticky, make it very hard for people to switch out, because as you start to upload your data, your content, more people start accessing it there, you start sharing it there, you find that you're kind of welded to that platform. That content becomes a kind of glue that retains users. The second set of tools are tools for discovery. Tools for discovery make it possible for people to find things. So as an ever-growing number of developers are building experiences on these platforms, and as an ever-increasing number of consumers are uploading content, of course, very quickly you have a problem of how do you find anything? How does anybody find anything? And so the tools for navigating through all the offerings. Now, these tools might be in the form of an app store, they might be in the form of search, it might be voice command in the example of, say, Amazon Alexa. But in any case, the way people discover stuff, this is a key value control point, and it's usually one that's closely guarded by the companies that build these platforms. The third value control point on top of platforms is the system of monetization. This is how you get paid. Of course, anybody that's developing a product that's intended to be a business, anybody that's trying to substitute a digital service for an existing physical product, they're going to need to get paid. And those payments go through the platforms. And this is the focus of many of the complaints about antitrust and monopolization, that these platform owners control too much of the monetization. And that monetization function is baked in, as I described earlier when I talked about the layers of the platform. That's baked into the platform. And it'll be a very difficult thing to disconnect that or extract that out. And so I think that that's a very challenging proposition to try to extract that away. Monetization comes in many forms. Companies like Alphabet dominate digital advertising. Same with Facebook. These are companies that know a great deal about what you're doing. They're able to present new offers to you wherever you go on the internet or on digital device. Other ways to do monetization include things like app stores. This is where Apple is dominant. And every year, for the last 8 years, we've seen Apple's revenue from the App Store increase and grow by double digits. It is the single fastest growing source of revenue of all of Apple's revenue. And today it's only second to the iPhone in terms of total contribution to overall revenues at Apple. So there are a number of different ways to monetize. The key point is that that monetization function is baked into the platform. It's impossible to offer services on top of these unless you go to the cumbersome process of collecting a credit card off of the platform in some other way. And that makes it very difficult for companies to establish their own revenue model outside of the typically 30% charge that's taken if you sell things through the platform. And then, of course, the fourth and most obvious value control point is digital devices. We all love our smartphones. We carry them with us. We carry them in our pockets. They're almost a fashion accessory at this point, and it's a highly anticipated feature of everyone's life to have a smartphone with you all the time. But that's not the only digital device. Today, we're surrounded by a sea of network devices, whether they're smart telephones or smart light bulbs or speakers at home that you can talk to, and other appliances that you can use voice communication with or connect those devices to your smartphone. These devices, these smart devices, in a way, you can think of them as replicating the economics of the computer or the smartphone, in the sense that once you put intelligence and connectivity inside of a digital device, the company that provides that intelligence and that connectivity is able to siphon the value out of the device. And so even as a smart TV drops in price, becomes commoditized, the value of the connectivity and the data that can be extracted from the user, that value goes up. And so there's an interesting dynamic just within devices whereby the platforms can commoditize the devices. And sometimes they do this deliberately. You'll notice that, for instance, Amazon sells their hardware for rock bottom prices. They're not trying to maximize revenue or profit on device sales. Whereas Apple, of course, does maximize their profit on their devices, and they're able to command profit margins for smartphones that were hitherto unthinkable in other kinds of consumer electronics. And so the point here is simply that there isn't one single strategy. In fact, there's room for strategic diversity among the great platforms. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of it. It's also what makes it extremely difficult for regulators, because there is no one rule for how to operate such a platform. Each company is going to choose its strategic intent. Each company will bundle some of these features together. They'll typically bundle together some media offerings, some apps, some tools for content creation together with a device, and present that in one attractive bundle to a consumer. And those companies can then decide where they want to take their profit margin and which parts of that offering they're going to offer below cost in order to make the whole bundle appealing to a consumer. And that bundling process will certainly be the subject of greater controversy and investigation as these investigations into monopolistic practices go further. This process of vaporizing parts of the economy, entire industries in some cases, replacing them with digital services, has been going on now for more than 10 years. And as I've described so far, you've seen that the companies that figured it out and mastered this technique have been able to grow in valuation tremendously. Effectively, they've siphoned the value out of the old industries and they've absorbed it into their own businesses. This is going to continue, and in some respects, the COVID-19 pandemic is accelerating these trends because it's forcing us all to adopt virtual and placeless work or learning. So where some companies were comfortable with the idea of having a remote workforce before the pandemic, now suddenly every company was confronted with that as a requirement. And overnight, in the span of 1 month, March 2020. Workers all over the world were obligated to stay at home and find some way to connect back to their offices, using typically a computer or a smartphone. Overnight, companies like Zoom that offer video telecommunications and video conferencing and video calling saw the numbers of users increase 100-fold. So there was a tremendous shift in a very short period of time towards people in large-scale, mass-scale adoption of vaporized services. And this will probably persist. So even at some point when the pandemic ceases to be this urgent issue and we're able to return to some kind of normal behavior in the future, I don't think we'll all go back to the way things were. I think that some of the changes that have occurred, whether it's at-home delivery or the substitution of television for on-demand services, I think you're going to start to see some of these trends and habits and behaviors that have been adopted during the pandemic will persist. And so that means, in that sense, the pandemic is driving the acceleration and adoption of these technologies. And at this point, you might be wondering, well, what else is going to be vaporized? What's next to be vaporized? We talked about media, we talked about retail, we talked about several other industries. I think there are industries that are ripe for vaporization. They include any industry that is very expensive, that has bloated cost structure, and a very rigid process that tends to be dominated by manual labor, by humans doing the jobs. And there are many examples of industries that have not yet been transformed by digital technology to the extent that the other industries I talked about earlier have been. Some of those include things like healthcare, transportation, traditional strategy consulting is being disrupted right now. Government, in some respects. Warfare is being disrupted right now. It's being replaced by digital warfare. And so as you look across the broader economy, you can see that there are these pockets, certain industries that really weren't disrupted terribly much. And some of them are old style manufacturing. Some of them are simply old style delivery of key services. Some of them are highly regulated, like healthcare. And that regulation has been a kind of a defense for those industries. They've been protected from the buffets of the transformation that's occurred to so many other industries. But now that's starting to change. And again, the pandemic is driving some of this. So for instance, let's look at healthcare. For a couple of years now, healthcare companies and health maintenance organizations have been able to offer a virtual visit to a doctor as an option. But it wasn't widely adopted. Many people prefer to see their doctor in person. But of course, once the pandemic happened, now suddenly no one really wanted to go to the clinic. You didn't go there unless you absolutely had to, because the hospital and the clinic was a possible vector of transmission of the disease. Most people didn't want to go see their doctor for a regular checkup. And so we saw mass adoption of using a mobile app to connect with a doctor. And very typically, the doctor will give you a video consultation. You can schedule it, or sometimes you ask for it and the doctor will simply video you back and call you back in a moment or two. And I've done this myself, I'm sure you have as well. Who wants to go to the doctor's office? That's where the sick people are. If I need to speak to my doctor, I'd rather do it on my phone at the convenience of my own home. That's just the very beginning. But it's important to understand that the very beginning is like the thin end of the wedge. And so what happens typically in a traditional industry is that one piece of the value chain or one piece of the supply chain is digitized, decomposed, dematerialized into software. And then the adjacent pieces start to also become digitized, and they have to interface with that, so they adopt some digital interfaces, but then they start to also become decomposed and dematerialized, and gradually it spreads through the entire business. And I think that's likely to happen in healthcare and in ways that people might not expect. Let's consider healthcare as one of the businesses. And so you may have noticed that during the pandemic, there was a mass adoption of the ability to see your doctor on an app or on a mobile phone. That was a big transformation. Those apps existed before the pandemic, but the people flocked to them and started to do mass adoption of that when it became dangerous to go to the clinic. Suddenly, no one wanted to go see their doctor in the clinic because the clinic was a vector of transmission. It could have been a place where you might get COVID-19. Who wants to go see a doctor at the clinic? There's sick people there. And so it was much better to be at home and see the doctor from the convenience and safety of your home. And so people adopted the virtual visit to the doctor. And so that way we kind of vaporized the visit to the doctor's office. That's a small example, but it's worth noting that those early stages of digitization and vaporization, they always start small. You find that one feature in a product offering or in a value chain that can be replaced by software. And as soon as you do that, there are adjacent opportunities that can also be replaced by software, and you start to see the process of digitization spread. And I think this is happening now in a big way in the healthcare industry. In the United States today, healthcare consists mostly of sick care. In other words, our US health system doesn't really respond to you until you're sick. And when you present yourself as sick, very typically you're prescribed some medication. And so we have a pharmacological approach of responding to sickness and dealing with sickness. And in the pharma industry, the big priority has been lifestyle drugs, subscription drugs, drugs that you take for the rest of your life if you have a particular condition. That's a high margin project. It's got recurring revenue. And so it's a very attractive business model for the pharma industries. And so increasingly, Americans are being prescribed medications. And this is growing to be true all over the world, so it's not limited to the United States. And in some cases, it's possible to say that the pharma companies have greatly abused this opportunity by fostering drugs and drug addiction. And certainly the case of the opioids is a great illustration of that point. So we may be at a point right now where this idea of providing people pills, using chemistry to prevent or to cure a medical disorder or disease, we may be at a point where that's ripe for disruption. How might that occur? How might a digital device substitute for medication? It's a funny question when you think about it, but in fact you can see if you look closely at what the major platforms are doing, this is already built into their strategies. Companies like Alphabet through Google Ventures, and Apple, particularly with their smartwatch, and Amazon through their initiatives for healthcare, are all approaching the healthcare industry from an information-first perspective. And remember, they're always focused on extracting data assets and controlling those data assets. And the medical field is rich with data assets. In a sense, your whole medical history is this rich gold mine of data about you and your needs. The approach that the technology companies are taking, there's diversity. Each company has a slightly different approach, but there's one commonality to all of them. They're seeking to use information as a substitute for medication. And that has profound implications for the companies that dominate the healthcare field today, the big pharma companies. They're not following this. They're not playing on the same game. They're still operating on a 20th century model, while the 21st century data platforms are coming in and they're using information to keep people healthier longer. When you talk to people who are focused on digital health, they'll say, look, we want to use health data to keep people healthy so that they use less of the healthcare system. Because as I mentioned earlier, our healthcare system doesn't really respond until you're sick. So if we can keep people healthier longer and do that with predictive analytics, where we track your behavior through something like a wearable, like a smartwatch, that'll tell you about your behavior and can cross-reference your data with data of millions and millions of other people who are using that same smartwatch, then that platform can start to make recommendations for your lifestyle. And if you follow those recommendations, it might keep you healthier longer, and it might keep you away from a lifestyle drug. The implications for the pharma companies are profound. Because if the longer I stay healthier, the longer any of us stays healthier, the less need we're going to have for pharmas. And as a result, the lifetime value to them, of me as a customer, will go down the longer I stay healthier. In a way, it's similar to Uber. And you might wonder, how am I going to pull Uber into this conversation at this point? But think about it like this. Uber makes it possible for you to have transportation on demand without owning a car. And so in that way, the smartphone is a substitute for car ownership. It doesn't replace the car. It doesn't replace the driver. It replaces the switchboard. It replaces the dispatcher that sends the driver to your home. But it also means that you don't need to buy a car. It means anybody can have transportation. So even people who can't drive, people who are too young to drive, people who don't have a driver's license or can't afford a car, or people who are disabled or otherwise abled who don't have the ability to drive, or older people who simply don't want to drive. All of these people now have access to transportation. And so services like Uber, on-demand transport services, have made it possible for the smartphone to substitute from car ownership and have thereby greatly expanded the number of people who can have access to transportation. And in the process, they've done something else. They're presenting us an alternative to car ownership. And you'll notice this if you talk to people in their 20s who use Uber frequently or other rideshare services. They'll tell you they're not that interested in owning a car. For my generation, for several generations of Americans, car ownership was an ideal. It was a principle of freedom and liberty and independence and the idea that you could get out and drive. But today, the car is seen as a millstone. It's an expensive thing that you have to house. You have to pay rent for its, if you live in a city, you have to rent a parking spot. It's like paying rent on a second apartment. You have to pay insurance, you have to fill it up with gasoline and maintain it. Those are all expenses that people find unnecessary if they can have transportation on demand. And so what's happening there is that people are starting to develop a preference for not owning a car and getting the car of their choice when they need it and not having to own it or manage it or maintain it afterwards. The smartphone apps and the rideshare services make that possible. And so thereby our demand for cars over the lifetime of a consumer will go down. You'll buy fewer cars in your lifetime. And that's an existential threat to the auto manufacturers. The same thing, by analogy, is true for the pharmaceutical companies. If the digital companies can keep us healthier longer, then in our lifetime, our demand for pharma products will go down. And that's a real genuine problem for the healthcare industries. So what's next? Innovation never stops, and in particular in the technology industry, with the cutthroat competition and the relentless drive for new technology, there's always something next. There's always something new. And we're on the brink of another round of transformation. It will come with 5G. Now, earlier in this conversation, I talked about the previous rounds of innovation in mobile telecommunication, particularly 3G, third generation digital service, and 4G. Well, 5G is the next iteration. And 5G is a pretty significant change. You've heard a lot about it. Some people think of it as just faster internet, but that's not true. It's low latency internet. And the 5G networks themselves are essentially distributed artificial intelligence systems. And that's a radically different way to think about a telecommunications network. By artificial intelligence, I mean that the network itself is aware. It's aware when systems go down or when a part of it breaks. It's aware of places, physical places where repairs need to be made. Some of the 5G networks can actually automatically dispatch a ground crew to go repair a broken antenna or some other break in the network, some physical damage to the network after a storm. And so the idea then is a 5G network will also embrace and in some ways be integrated with artificial intelligence and cognitive computing. It also means that the cloud is going to shift. There's a transformation underway in the cloud industry where we're shifting towards edge computing. And this will become an increasingly important feature of the infrastructure of 5G. Edge computing means that you put the computing power right where the computers need it. So if you consider something like an autonomous vehicle driving by itself, interesting idea when you're testing out a few of them, but once you start to have those at scale, let's say in 10 years' time, there might be a lot of intelligent cars or automated vehicles on the road. Well, now you're going to have a huge problem because it takes too long to send that data back to the cloud, the cloud that's being gathered, the data that's being gathered by the sensors in the car. You need that compute power right at the edge of the network. And so the 5G networks are being designed with this in mind, the idea that we can deliver compute power, and particularly AI models, can be delivered right to devices at the edge of the network, right where they need it, in real time or really, really fast. The other thing that's coming next is more devices will be connected. So we've been hearing about Internet of Things since 2013, and it was originally a fanciful notion from the early Internet days, but it's becoming increasingly true that whatever can be connected will be connected. And most of these devices will be connected through the 5G network. And they'll be connected to artificial intelligence. And they'll be generating data assets that are stored in the cloud. And so you can start to see there's a whole architecture here that interweaves. It's like a system of systems. And as that emerges, that's going to transform many aspects, not just of business, but of society. For instance, the concept of a smart city is something that people have been exploring and discussing and experimenting with for a number of years. But this combination of technologies, 5G, integrated artificial intelligence and machine learning, other forms of cognitive computing, big data, sensor networks integrated into roadways and lights and other Internet of Things devices on the edge of the network. All of these things together, this system of systems, will make that vision of the smart city possible. And so I think we're going to see a great acceleration towards smart cities over the course of the next decade. Now, you might be wondering at this point, what can you do? What can your company do to deal with this vaporized trend? The first point, of course, is simply to do what you're doing right now. Get smart about it and start to become aware of these techniques and start to see the invisible trends that are happening in the cloud and in the network. Understand the technologies that are reshaping society and reshaping the economy. And in some cases, your company might need to do what other traditional companies have done, which is to simply spin out the old assets and reinvent themselves as a pure play cloud-based company. That's exactly what IBM just did. Remember, IBM began its life with tabulating machines in 1890 for the U.S. Census, punch card machines, so kind of a mechanical way of dealing with information technology. Then, of course, they rose to great prominence with mainframe computers, which still to this day is a big part of their business. They created the personal computer. But along the way, IBM has been successful in spinning out old businesses and reinventing itself. And in this latest iteration, by merging with Red Hat and embracing hybrid cloud and making that their core focus, IBM is seeking to regain some lost ground. They're going to de-accession or spin out their traditional business of managed infrastructure and focus entirely on cloud and hybrid cloud. It remains to be seen whether or not that strategy will work, but it's a bold move by a traditional company, by a company that's been around in one form or another for more than 100 years. And what's really interesting to me about IBM is that they are getting rid of the machines in their name, International Business Machines, and now gradually it's becoming pure software. So they are literally an example now of a fully vaporized traditional company. Now you might be wondering, well, what's next for me? How does this affect my own career? And that's an excellent question. I'm hopeful that this talk and some of the other work that I've done in the book I've written will help inspire you to consider what comes next for you yourself. I certainly think it's everybody's job to educate themselves about the technologies that are going to shape the future. Once you understand the technologies, you start to see them and you can see them operating even in things that we take for granted. Like an Alexa speaker that you can talk to and ask for a podcast on demand. Just that sentence wasn't something you could have said 10 years ago. So for some people, it seems like magic that you can talk to a speaker and it will respond and talk back to you. Other folks get a little more curious about it. They want to understand how that works. What are the combination of technologies that make that possible? I think that's a good habit of mind, and I'd urge you to cultivate that curiosity. Understand how these technologies work and how they might affect a business like yours. The second thing you might do is look at your own business and your career within that industry and ask yourself, what part of this could be replaced by software? What part of what I do could be substituted by software? Now that's a scary thought, right? Because you're thinking, wait, are you talking about automating me out of my job? Well, I guarantee you somebody's thinking about that right now. And so if you're not aware of it and if you're not concerned about it, then you're basically a sitting duck. It's really important to get ahead of it. Start to understand the technologies, because here's the fact. It's not likely that we're going to entirely automate humans out of the workplace. Many people speculate about that. It's kind of a doomsday scenario for artificial intelligence. But what we've seen again and again and again is that humans with machines actually perform better than fully automated systems. And that's because these automated systems to this day are still prone to some basic flaws that allow them to come to the wrong conclusions and make some drastically bad decisions. You need humans in the loop. So the more you understand about technologies like artificial intelligence and other forms of cognitive computing, the better able you'll be to define a career whereby you can be working with the machines and using those machines to augment yourself in a way to give yourself superpowers and do your job even better. It might also cause you to rethink what's valuable about your job. And here's an example I'll use right now. There's a new form of artificial intelligence. It's called GPT-3, and it's generative, pre-trained neural networks that can actually write. They can actually compose sentences. And I think if you're in any kind of creative business, if you're a writer or in advertising, I think you really need to pay attention to GPT-3. It's early stage. It's just the third generation. That's all that 3 stands for. But of course, like everything digital, this version works pretty well. The next version will work even better. And eventually there'll be a version that works really, really well. Already GPT-3 is able to generate things like poetry and descriptions of products and so forth. It'll get increasingly capable as it learns more. Because the way you work with these networks is you train them on huge amounts of data. That's what the whole point of the pre-trained in that acronym stands for. So if you're a writer, if you're in the creative industries, don't pretend to be secure in the thought that somehow a machine will never do your job. That's not true. Already there are people working on ways to use GANs, which are generative networks, neural networks, that can generate images and generate sound. And so it's not impossible to imagine in the future computers will generate audio and video and generate characters and stories. I know that sounds preposterous, but then again, 20 years ago when I talked about putting video on a mobile phone, people thought that was preposterous as well. It might not happen tomorrow, it might not happen a year after that, but it certainly will happen over the course of the next 10 years. And so for your own career and your own benefit, I urge you to develop a curiosity about these things and start to probe a little deeper and understand how they work. And I wish you the best on your own vaporized journey.